Help was not far off, though in this case it meant mastery. The day of the Moorish pirates was over. Henceforth they might, and did, triumphantly assault and batter Spanish and Venetian ships, but they would do this under the captaincy of the allies they had called in, under the leadership of the Turkish corsairs. The Moors had shown the way, and the corsairs needed little bidding to follow it. It is time to ask how it was that a spacious land seemed to lie vacant for the corsairs to occupy, and a land, too, that offered almost every feature that a pirate could desire for the safe and successful prosecution of his trade. Geographers tell us that in climate and formation the island of Barbary, for such it is geologically, is really part of Europe, towards which in history it has played so unfriendly a part. Once the countries which we now know as Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco stood up abruptly as an island with a comparatively small lake washing its northern shore, and a huge ocean on the south. That ocean is now the Sahara, which engineers dream of again flooding with salt water. That ocean is now the Sahara, which engineers dream of again flooding with salt water and so forming an inland African sea. The lake is now the Mediterranean, or rather its western basin, for we know that the Barbary Island was once nearly a peninsula joined at its two ends to Spain and Sicily, and that its Atlas ranges form the connection between the Sierra Nevada and Mount Etna. By degrees, the isthmus between Cape Bona and Sicily sank out of sight, and the ocean flowed between Spain and Africa, while the great sea to the south dried up into the immense stony waste which is known preeminently as the Sahara, the desert, a tract of land, bare as the back of a beast, without trees or mountains. Through one or both of these narrow straits, Gibraltar and Malta, all vessels from the outer ocean bound for the ports of France and Italy and the Levant were obliged to pass, and it must be remembered that just about the time when the corsairs made their appearance in Barbary, the riches of the newfound Western world were beginning to pour through the straits to meet those of the East which were brought to France and Spain, England and Holland from Alexandria and Smyrna. An immense proportion of the trade of Europe had to cross the western basin of the Mediterranean, of which Barbary formed the southern boundary. Any bold man who could hold Tunis at the eastern corner, or Algiers in the middle, or Ceuta or Tangier at the western point might reckon upon numerous opportunities of stopping argosies of untold wealth as they passed by his lair. The situation seemed purposely contrived for corsairs. More than this, the coast was just what a pirate wants. The map shows a series of natural harbors, often backed by lagoons, which offer every facility for the escape of the rover from his pursuers. And while in the 16th century there were no deep forts for vessels of heavy draught, there were endless creeks, shallow harbors, and lagoons where the corsairs' galleys, which never drew more than 6 feet of water, could take refuge. Behind Jerba, the fabled island of the Lotus Eaters, was an immense island sea, commanded in the Middle Ages by castles and affording a refuge for which the rovers had often had cause to be grateful. Merchant vessels were shy of sailing in the dangerous gulf of the Greater Syrtis, with its heavy tides and spreading sandbanks, and even the war galleys of Venice and Spain were at a disadvantage when maneuvering in its treacherous eddies against the corsair who knew every inch of the coast. Passing westward, a famous medieval fortress with the remains of a harbor is seen at Madia, the Africa of the chroniclers. Next, Tunis presents the finest harbor on all the Barbary coast. Within its goleta, or throat, a vessel is safe from all the winds that blow, and if a canal were cut to join it with the inland lake of Biserta, a deep harbor would be formed big enough to hold all the shipping of the Mediterranean. The ancient ports of Carthage and Porto Farina offered more protection in the corsairs' time than now when the sand has choked the coast. And in the autumn months, a vessel needed all the shelter she could get when the Cyprian wind was blowing off Cape Bona, close to the present Algerine frontier in Tabarka, which the Lomellini family of Genoa found a thriving situation for their trading establishments. Lacal, once a famous nest of pirates and then a fine harbor, as the merchants of Marseille discovered when they intended the coral fisheries from the neighboring bastion, the France. Bona, just beyond, has its roads and formerly possessed a deep harbor. Gigil, an impregnable post held successively by Phoenicians, Normans, Romans, Pisans, and Genoese, till Barbarossa got possession of it and made it a fortress of refuge for his corsairs, stands on a rocky peninsula joined by a sandy isthmus to the mainland, with a port well sheltered by a natural breakwater. Further on were Buji, its harbor well protected from the worst winds. Algiers, not then a port but soon to become one, Cherchel, with a harbor to be shunned in a heavy swell from the north, but otherwise a valuable nook for sea rovers. Tunis, not always accessible but safe when you were inside. And Oran, with the important harbor of Mars, El Kabir, the Portus Divinus of the Romans, while beyond the Jamia El Ghazawat, or Pirates' Mosque, shows where a favorite creek offered an asylum between the brothers' rocks for distressed corsairs. Passing Tangiers and Ceuta, Septa, and turning beyond the straits, various shelters are found, and amongst others, the celebrated ports of Salé, which, in spite of its bar of sand, managed to send out many mischievous craft to harass the Argosies on their return from the New World. Not only were there ports in abundance for the shelter of galleys, but the land behind was all that could be desired. River, indeed, there was none, capable of navigation, but the very shortness of the watershed, which precluded the possibility of great streams, brought with it a counterbalancing advantage. For the mountains rise so steep and high near the coast that the corsairs' lookout could sight the vessels to be attacked a long way out to sea, and thus give notice of a prize or warning of an enemy. Moreover, the land produced all that was needed to content the heart of man. Below the mountains where the Berbers dwelt, and the steppes where Arab shepherds roamed, fertile valleys spread to the seashore. Jerba was a perfect garden of corn and fruit, vines, olives, almonds, apricots, and figs. Tunis stood in the midst of green fields and deserved the title of the white, the odoriferous, the flowery bride of the West. Though indeed the second epithet, according to its inhabitants, was derived from the odor of the lake which received the drainage of the city, to which they ascribed this peculiar salubrity. What more could be required in a land which was now to become a nest of pirates? Yet, as though this were not sufficient, one more virtue was added. The coast was visited by terrible gales, which, while avoidable by those who had experience and knew where to run, were fatal to the unwary, and foiled many an attack of the avenging enemy. It remains to explain how it was that the corsairs were able to possess themselves of this convenient territory. which was neither devoid of inhabitants nor without settled governments. North Africa, the only Africa known to the ancients, had seen many rulers come and go since the Arabs under Uqba first overran its plains and valleys. Dynasty had succeeded dynasty. The Arab governors under the caliphs of Damascus and Baghdad had made room for the houses of Idris, AD 788, and Aghlab, 800. These in turn had given way to the Fatimi caliphs, 909, and when these schismatics removed their seat of power from their newly founded capital of Mahdiya to their final metropolis of Cairo, 968, their western empire speedily split up into the several princedoms of the Seiris of Tunis, the Beni Hamad of Tilimsan, and other minor governments. At the close of the 11th century, the Murabites or Almoravides, a Berber dynasty, imposed their authority over the greater part of North Africa and Spain, but gave place in the middle of the 12th to the Muwahids or Almohades, whose rule extended from the Atlantic to Tunis and endured for over 100 years. On the ruins of their vast empire, 3 separate and long-lived dynasties sprang up: the Beni Hafs in Tunis, 1228 to 1534, the Beni Siyan in Central Maghreb, 1235 to 1400, and the Beni Merin in Morocco, 1200 to 1550. To complete the chronology, it may be added that these were succeeded in the 16th century by the Corsair Pashas. Afterwards, Deys of Algiers, the Turkish Pashas, or Beys of Tunis, and the Sherifs, or Emperors of Morocco. The last still continue to reign, but the Deys of Algiers have given place to the French, and the Bey of Tunis is under French tutelage. Except during the temporary excitement of a change of dynasty, the rule of these African princes was generally mild and enlightened. They came for the most part of the indigenous Berber population and were not naturally disposed to intolerance or unneighborliness. The Christians kept their churches and were suffered to worship unmolested. We read of a bishop of Fez as late as the 13th century, and the kings of Morocco and Tunis were usually on friendly terms with the Pope. Christians were largely enrolled in the African armies and were even appointed to civil employment. The relations of the rulers of Barbary with the European states throughout the greater part of this period, from the 11th century when the fighting Fatimis left Tunis and went eastward to Egypt, to the 16th when the fighting Turks came westward to molest the peace of the Mediterranean, were eminently wise and statesmanlike. The Africans wanted many of the industries of Europe. Europe required the skins and raw products of Africa, and a series of treaties involving a principle of reciprocity was the result. No doubt the naval inferiority of the African states to the trading republics of the Mediterranean was a potent factor in bringing about this satisfactory arrangement, but it is only right to admit the remarkable fairness, moderation, and probity of the African princes in the settlement and maintenance of these treaties. As a general rule, Sicily and the commercial republics were allied to the rulers of Tunis and Tlemcen and Fez by bonds of amity and mutual advantage. One after the other, Pisa, Genoa, Provence, Aragon, and Venice concluded commercial treaties with the African sovereigns and renewed them from time to time. Some of these states had special quarters reserved for them at Tunis, Ceuta, and other towns, and all had their consuls in the 13th century who were protected in a manner that the English agent at Algiers would have envied 70 years ago. The African trade was especially valuable to the Pisans and Genoese, and there was a regular African company trading at the ports of Tripoli, Tunis, Buyeya, Ceuta, and Saleh. Indeed, the Genoese went so far as to defend Ceuta against Christian crusaders. So much did commerce avail against religion. So much did commerce avail against religion. And on the other hand, The Christian residents at Tunis, a western metropolis of Islam, had their own place of worship where they were free to pray undisturbed. As late as 1530, this tolerance was largely due to the mild and judicious government of the Beni Hafs, whose 3 centuries sway at Tunis was an unmixed benefit to their subjects and to all who had relation with them. Not that the years passed by without war and retaliation, or that treaties made piracy impossible. In the early and more pugnacious days of the Saracen domination, conflicts were frequent. The Fatimid Caliphs conquered and held all the larger islands of the western Mediterranean, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearic Isles. In 1002, the Saracens pillaged Pisa, and the Pisans retaliated by burning an African fleet. 3 years later, Muget, the lord of Majorca and conqueror of Sardinia, burned part of Pisa, and another incursion is recorded in 1011 from his stronghold at Luni in Etruria. This terrible scourge ravaged the country round until the Pope drove him out of Italy, and the Pisans and others turned him out of Sardinia. 1017, we read of African fleets cruising with hostile intent of the Calabrian coast, and of the Pisans taking Bona, which was then a nest of corsairs. 1034, Mahdia was burnt in 1087. And Sicily conquered by the Normans about the same time, 1072. But these were in the early days, and even then were the exceptions. In succeeding centuries, under more settled governments, war became very rare, and mutual amity was the prevailing policy. Piracy was always distinctly prohibited in the commercial treaties of the African states. Nevertheless, piracy went on, and most pertinaciously on the part of the Christians. The Greeks, Sardinians, Maltese, and Genoese were by far the worst members of the fraternity of rovers, as the treaties themselves prove. The increase of commerce under the stimulus of the Crusades. The increase of commerce under the stimulus of the Crusades tempted the adventurous, and the absence of any organized state navies gave them immunity, and there was generally a war afoot between some nation or other, Christian or Muslim, and piracy in the then state of international law at once became legitimate privateering. At once became legitimate privateering. Our buccaneers of the Spanish Main had the same apology to offer, but it is important to observe that all this was private piracy. The African and Italian governments distinctly repudiated the practice and bound themselves to execute any corsair of their own country whom they might arrest, and to deliver all his goods over to the state which he had robbed. These early corsairs were private freebooters, totally distinct from the authorized pirates of later years. These early corsairs were private freebooters, totally distinct from the authorized pirates of later days.